The invitation. It was a warm, sunny afternoon when Layla, Alex, and Tom met at their favorite coffee shop. They had known each other for years, ever since high school. Now, they were all in their 20s, but their friendship had not changed. They still loved to hang out, chat, and sometimes, as they did today, plan adventures together. Today, Alex seemed a little more excited than usual. He was holding a letter in his hand, and he couldn't wait to share it with his friends. "Guys, you won't believe this," he said, waving the envelope in front of them. "I got an invitation." Layla and Tom looked at each other, curious. "An invitation? To what?" Layla asked, taking a sip of her coffee. Alex grinned. "It's from my aunt. She owns a lake house up in the mountains, and she's inviting us to spend the weekend there. It's a beautiful place, surrounded by nature." Tom raised an eyebrow. "That sounds nice. Why are you so excited?" Alex lowered his voice, as if he was sharing a secret. "Well, there's something strange about the house." Layla and Tom leaned forward, their curiosity growing. "What do you mean?" Layla asked. Alex hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "My aunt has always told stories about the lake house. She says it's haunted." Tom laughed. "Haunted? You mean like ghosts and stuff?" Alex nodded. "Yes, exactly. She says the place is old and strange things happen there. People hear noises at night, see strange lights on the water, and some even say they've seen figures in the windows. My aunt has lived there for years, and she believes it's just the house settling, but after hearing so many stories, I'm not sure." Layla felt a chill run down her spine. She loved spooky stories, but they always made her a little nervous. "Are you serious?" she asked. "Do you really think there's something to these stories?" Alex smiled, trying to ease her worries. "I don't know. That's why I want to go. It would be fun to check it out, don't you think? We could spend the weekend there, have some fun, and see if any of the stories are true." Tom laughed again. "I'm in. It'll be like a weekend adventure. We'll bring some snacks, some drinks, and maybe even tell some ghost stories around a campfire. What could go wrong?" Layla wasn't so sure. "But what if there really is something weird going on there? What if it's dangerous?" Alex shrugged. "That's the fun of it. We won't know until we go. And hey, even if the place is haunted, we'll stick together. Nothing can go wrong as long as we're all there." Tom grinned. "I agree. Let's do it. It'll be an adventure we'll never forget." Layla hesitated, still feeling a little uneasy. She didn't like the idea of staying in a haunted house, but the more she thought about it, the more curious she became. She couldn't back out now, especially when Alex and Tom were so excited. "All right," she said finally. "Let's do it. But we're bringing a lot of snacks, and I'm bringing a flashlight, just in case." The three friends laughed, and Alex quickly pulled out his phone to make plans. "I'll text my aunt to let her know we're coming. We can leave this weekend. It'll be perfect." The next few days passed quickly as the friends prepared for their trip. They packed their bags with clothes, food, and drinks. Layla made sure to bring extra batteries for her flashlight, and Tom packed a camera, eager to take pictures of the haunted house. They were all excited, though Layla still couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Saturday morning came, and they drove up to the mountains. The drive was long, and the roads grew narrower as they approached the lake house. Tall trees surrounded the road, their branches swaying in the wind. Layla felt the air grow cooler as they neared their destination, and she glanced nervously out the window. "This place is so quiet," she said. "I've never been up here before. It's kind of creepy." Alex smiled. "It's just the mountains. It's peaceful here, and the house is beautiful. You'll see when we get there." As they turned a corner, the lake house finally came into view. It was a large old house with a stone foundation. The windows were covered with thick vines, and the roof had a few patches where the shingles looked worn. The house sat on the edge of a dark, still lake. The water was calm, reflecting the sky and the surrounding trees. A small wooden dock extended into the water, and a few boats were tied up on the shore. "It's not bad," Tom said, looking at the house. "It's a little old, but it has character. I can see why Alex's aunt likes it." Layla wasn't so sure. The house looked like something out of an old movie, the kind of house where ghosts might hide in the shadows. She shivered and tried to push the thought out of her mind. Alex parked the car in front of the house, and they all got out. As they walked toward the front door, Layla couldn't help but notice how quiet everything was. The only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional bird call from the trees. It felt as if the world around them had paused, waiting. The door opened before they could knock. A woman in her late 50s stood in the doorway, smiling warmly. She had short grey hair and wore a comfortable sweater and jeans. This was Alex's aunt, Mrs. Williams. "Welcome," she said, stepping aside to let them in. "I'm so glad you could make it. I hope you'll enjoy your stay here. It's such a peaceful place, even if it's a little mysterious." Layla smiled politely. "Thank you for having us. It's beautiful here." Mrs. Williams led them inside. The house was just as old on the inside as it looked on the outside. The floors were made of dark wood, and the walls were covered with old portraits and tapestries. The furniture was antique but comfortable. Layla noticed that the house had a strange smell, like old books mixed with the scent of pine trees. "I'll show you to your rooms," Mrs. Williams said. "You can settle in, and then we'll have some lunch." The friends followed Mrs. Williams up the stairs to the second floor. There were 3 rooms, one for Alex, one for Tom, and one for Layla. Each room had a large bed, a dresser, and a small window that looked out over the lake. After they unpacked, the friends sat down to eat. Mrs. Williams had prepared a simple meal of sandwiches, chips, and fruit. As they ate, she told them more stories about the house. "People have been coming to this lake for generations," she explained. "Some say it's because the water is enchanted. There's a story about a young woman who disappeared in the lake many years ago. Some people say her spirit still haunts the house, though I've never seen anything myself." Layla glanced at Alex, who was listening intently. Tom didn't seem worried, but Layla could feel her heart racing. Something about the stories made her uneasy. After lunch, the group decided to explore the property. They walked down to the dock and took a small boat out onto the lake. The water was calm, but there was an eerie silence that made Layla feel like they were being watched. As they rowed around the lake, Layla looked up at the house. She could see the windows clearly now, and for a moment she thought she saw a shadow move across one of the windows. She blinked, but when she looked again, the window was empty. "Did you see that?" Layla asked, her voice shaky. Tom looked over at the house. "See what?" "I swear I saw something," Layla said. "A shadow in the window." Alex smiled. "It's probably just the wind or the trees moving. Don't worry, Layla." But Layla couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. As the boat made its way back to the shore, the sky began to darken. A thick fog started to roll in from the lake, covering everything in a grey haze. "We should head inside," Mrs. Williams said. "The fog can be dangerous. It's easy to get lost in it." The friends quickly returned to the house, but Layla couldn't help but feel that the adventure had only just begun. Strange noises. That night the house felt different. The fog outside had settled into a thick blanket, hiding the stars and turning the moonlight into a dim glow. Inside, the old house creaked and groaned, its wooden beams and floors settling in the cold night air. Layla lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the unease that seemed to creep into her mind. It had been a quiet evening. After dinner, Mrs. Williams had told more stories about the lake house, some funny and light-hearted, others darker. She had mentioned that people who stayed here sometimes heard strange noises at night, but she always laughed it off, saying it was just the house being old. But Layla wasn't so sure. She had heard a faint scratching sound coming from the walls earlier, and a soft thump, like footsteps, from above. She tried to convince herself it was just the wind, but her mind wouldn't let go of the thought that something or someone was moving around in the house. From her window, she could see only the edge of the lake, now completely obscured by the fog. The moon's pale light filtered through the mist, casting eerie shadows on the water. It was beautiful, but it also made Layla feel even more nervous. She pulled the blankets tighter around herself and tried to relax, but sleep wouldn't come. Suddenly, she heard it again, a faint scratching, like something was dragging across the floor. She froze. It wasn't the wind. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. Layla sat up in bed, her heart racing. She listened closely, but the sound stopped. The house was quiet once more. She waited for a few minutes, but when she heard nothing else, she decided to get up. Maybe it was just the house settling, like Mrs. Williams had said. But Layla didn't want to be alone right now. She grabbed her flashlight, slipped on her slippers, and quietly opened her bedroom door. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through the windows. She hesitated, then stepped out into the hall. She could hear the soft murmurs of Alex and Tom's voices coming from the room next door, but it was clear they were asleep. The house felt emptier than it should. Layla tiptoed down the stairs, trying not to make any noise. The floorboards creaked under her feet, making her jump every time she took a step. She reached the bottom of the stairs and looked around. The living room was just as quiet as before. The fireplace was cold, and the old portraits on the walls seemed to watch her as she moved. She walked toward the kitchen, thinking that maybe a glass of water would help calm her nerves. But as she passed by the dining room, something caught her eye. The door to the basement was slightly open. Layla had seen the basement door earlier, but it had always been closed. She knew from Mrs. Williams' stories that the basement was off limits to guests. It was old and filled with old furniture, boxes, and forgotten things. But tonight, the door was ajar, and there was a faint light flickering from inside. Her heart skipped a beat. She didn't know what to think. Maybe it was just a lamp left on by accident, but it didn't feel right. The door had never been opened before. With her flashlight in hand, Layla approached the door, her footsteps hesitant. The light inside flickered again, casting strange shadows on the walls of the basement. She could feel her hands trembling as she slowly pushed the door open a little wider. The light inside was dim, but it was enough to make out the old wooden stairs leading down into the darkness. The air was cool, and there was a faint smell of mildew and dust. Layla stood at the top of the stairs, her breath shallow. She wanted to call out to Alex or Tom, but something kept her from doing it. She couldn't explain it, but she had a feeling that if she spoke, the moment would be ruined, and she wouldn't be able to go back. Instead, She stepped cautiously onto the first step, then the second, and the third. Each step creaked loudly in the silence, but she couldn't stop herself. Something was pulling her deeper into the basement. The light flickered again, and for a moment Layla thought she saw a figure moving at the bottom of the stairs. She froze, her heart pounding. She squinted into the darkness, but there was nothing there, nothing but the shadows. Her hand gripped the flashlight tighter as she reached the bottom of the stairs. The light from her beam cast strange angles across the basement. She quickly scanned the room, but it appeared empty. There were piles of old furniture, boxes, and even a few dusty bookshelves along the walls. The air was thick and musty, making it hard to breathe. As Layla turned to leave, she heard a noise. This time it was louder. A faint whisper, like someone was calling her name. Layla. She gasped and spun around, her flashlight beam shaking wildly. There was no one there. The basement was still empty. Her heart raced, and she felt her skin crawl. She quickly turned and ran up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind her. She stood in the hallway, trying to catch her breath. Her mind was spinning, but she couldn't explain what had just happened. It felt real, too real. But the house was old, and her mind was probably just playing tricks on her in the dark. She made her way back to her room, trying to ignore the fear creeping up her spine. As she crawled back into bed, she could hear the faint sound of creaking, like footsteps in the hallway. She held her breath, waiting for the sound to stop. It did, but the feeling of being watched stayed with her. The next morning, the sun was out, and the fog had lifted, leaving the lake sparkling in the light. Layla didn't sleep much that night, and she felt exhausted as she joined Alex and Tom in the kitchen for breakfast. They were already talking about their plans for the day, excited to explore the property further. Alex looked at her and smiled. "Did you sleep well?" Layla forced a smile, but she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. "Yeah, I did. Just had a weird night." Tom raised an eyebrow. "Weird how?" She hesitated for a moment. Should she tell them about the noise in the basement? Should she mention the strange whispering? Part of her wanted to keep it to herself, but another part felt like she needed to warn them. After all, they had come here for adventure, right? But when she looked at them, they seemed so happy, so carefree, that she decided not to say anything just yet. Maybe she was just imagining things. Maybe it was just the house settling. For now, she'd keep her story to herself. The truth revealed. The day passed without incident, but Layla's mind continued to race. She tried to enjoy the time with her friends, walking around the property and taking pictures by the lake, but the strange feeling from the night before refused to leave her. Every creak in the house, every rustle in the trees, seemed to remind her of the whisper she had heard. She kept replaying the strange events in her head, wondering if they could have been real, or if she was just imagining things. That evening, after dinner, the group sat in the living room. The air was growing colder as the sun set, and the light from the fireplace cast long shadows on the walls. They were all sitting comfortably drinking hot tea, when Alex suddenly broke the silence. "So I think it's time we investigate the house a little more," he said, grinning. "What do you guys think?" Layla raised an eyebrow. "You mean like a ghost hunt?" "Exactly," Alex said enthusiastically. "We've been talking about it all day. Why not go all the way and check out the place? Maybe we'll finally see something creepy." Tom laughed. "I'm in. I've got my camera ready." Layla hesitated. She wasn't sure if she was ready to revisit the basement or face whatever strange things had been happening. But then she looked at her friends. They were excited, eager for adventure. Maybe if they stuck together, they could figure out what was really going on in the house. Plus, she felt like she couldn't back out now, not after everything that had happened. "All right," she said. "Let's do it. But no going into the basement alone, okay?" "Agreed," Alex said, smiling. "Let's check out the whole house, together." The three friends grabbed flashlights and made their way through the darkened halls of the old house. The shadows seemed to grow larger as they moved, and the silence was broken only by the sound of their footsteps. The air was colder now, and Layla could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. They started on the second floor, checking every room, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. The rooms were all empty, except for the old furniture and paintings that filled the walls. Everything looked just as it had when they arrived, but Layla couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She couldn't explain it, but it felt like the house was watching them. "Let's go downstairs," Alex suggested, his voice echoing slightly in the still air. "We haven't really checked out the first floor yet." The group made their way down to the ground floor, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. As they passed the dining room, Layla's heart skipped a beat. The basement door was open again. "No," she whispered, feeling a rush of fear. "It wasn't open earlier, was it?" Tom frowned. "I don't think so. It was closed when we were downstairs before." "Maybe Mrs. Williams went down there," Alex suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. He didn't sound sure either. Layla looked at her friends, and something in her gut told her they needed to check it out. She took a deep breath. "We need to go down there, together." Tom nodded, his face serious. "Okay, but let's stick close. No splitting up." The three of them slowly approached the open door. The basement was dark, but the faint flickering light was visible from the bottom of the stairs. Layla felt a sense of dread wash over her. Something was down there. She didn't know what, but she could feel it. They took the first few steps together, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the quiet house. The stairs creaked beneath their weight, but no one spoke. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, they were hit by the familiar smell of dust and mildew, and the faint light ahead flickered again. They stood in the basement, the beams of their flashlights sweeping across the cluttered room. The light source seemed to be coming from a lamp sitting on a dusty table in the corner. But as they looked around, they didn't see anyone. No sign of Mrs. Williams or any other person. "Hello?" Alex called out. "Mrs. Williams, are you down here?" There was no answer, just the strange silence of the old house. Layla's heart raced as her flashlight swept across the dark corners of the room. Suddenly, something caught her eye. A figure in the farthest corner of the basement, standing just beyond the reach of their lights. At first she thought it was just an illusion, a trick of the light, but then the figure stepped forward. It was a woman. Her hair was long and wild, and her clothes were old, torn at the edges. Her skin was pale, almost ghostly, and her eyes were wide, filled with an unreadable emotion. Layla gasped and stepped backward, but Alex and Tom hadn't seen her yet. They were still looking around the room, unaware of what she had just seen. The woman didn't speak, but Layla could feel her eyes on her, as if the ghost was waiting for something. Then the woman slowly reached up and pointed toward the far wall of the basement. Layla's breath caught in her throat. Her flashlight followed the direction of the woman's finger, landing on a large old portrait that hung on the wall. The painting was of a young woman dressed in the same style as the ghost. She had long, dark hair and a sad expression on her face, as if she was trapped in the painting for eternity. The resemblance was uncanny. "What is this?" Layla whispered, moving toward the painting. Tom turned and looked at the portrait. "Wow, that's strange. It looks like the woman standing in the corner." He stepped closer. "Who is she?" Before Layla could answer, the ghostly figure slowly faded from view, as if she had never been there at all. The air grew cold, and a shiver ran down Layla's spine. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Alex nodded. "Yeah, I saw her. What just happened?" Tom was already inspecting the painting. "I think we need to find out who she is. Maybe Mrs. Williams knows." But just as they turned to leave, the basement door slammed shut, trapping them inside. The lights flickered, and the temperature dropped even further. The three friends stood frozen, looking at each other in panic. They were no longer alone in the house. Suddenly, the woman's voice echoed through the basement. "Leave this place," she whispered, "or you will never leave." The friends exchanged terrified glances. They had come for adventure, but now they were faced with something much darker than they had ever expected.